Roman numeral 3, Nietzsche. Read superficially, as he usually has been read, Nietzsche may appear to be in the same tradition, but he is not. It is for this reason above all that his attempt at a critique of Christianity, that is, in the subtitle of Nietzsche's Antichrist, must neither be ignored, whether to shield the author of or Christianity, nor dismissed as a barbarian protest against sympathy and virtue. To be sure, Nietzsche was no less than Kierkegaard an apostle of passion and a critic of hypocrisy, but he did not extol passion at the expense of reason, and he repudiated Christianity not because he considered it too rational, but because he considered it the archenemy of reason, and his caustic critique of faith, both in the Antichrist and elsewhere, reads like a considered censure of Kierkegaard among others. It is the differences between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard that strike us first, and in an overall accounting, the differences would surely far outweigh the similarities which Karl Jaspers has catalogued so carefully. See his lecture on the two men below. Jaspers assimilates Nietzsche to Kierkegaard and loses hold of that which mattered most to Nietzsche. Before Nietzsche published Zarathustra, he wrote The Gay Science. What is good-heartedness, refinement, and genius to me, when the human being who has these virtues tolerates slack feelings in his faith and judgments? Among certain pious ones I find a hatred of reason, and appreciated it. At least they thus betrayed their bad intellectual conscience. In his Zarathustra, Nietzsche says, weariness that wants to reach the ultimate, with one leap, with one fatal leap, a poor ignorant weariness that does not want to want any more. This created all gods and afterworlds. Believe me, my brothers, it was the body that despaired of the body. And in his Antichrist, 5 years later, in his long critique of faith, he writes, faith means not wanting to know what is true. Every one of these barbs, which could be multiplied almost at will by anyone who knows his Nietzsche, is as applicable to Kierkegaard as to those Nietzsche had in mind when he wrote, perhaps even more so, seeing how persistently the Dane deceived himself. After all, Kierkegaard himself insisted that it was the secret writing in my inmost parts which explained everything. And when we read his books in these terms, his conception of three stages and the teleological suspension of the ethical are seen to be in part the desperate attempts of a misshapen man who was, as he reveals in other contexts, completely dominated by the figure of his father to convince himself as well as a woman that the strange way in which he had broken his engagement with her had nothing at all to do with the all-too-human motives. It would be absurd to claim that such a psychological analysis does justice to his work. Of course it does not. The only reason for as much as mentioning these matters is that the desire not to know the truth was an important element in Kierkegaard's faith. Sigmund Freud could not have said that of Kierkegaard what, according to Ernest Jones, he often said of Nietzsche, that he had a more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived or was ever likely to live. Was Nietzsche an existentialist? When he first received attention, different facets of his thought were noted, and it was only in a defeated Germany after the First World War that Kierkegaard, who had made much of the existential, became popular, and Nietzsche was seen in a new light. Judged by our initial criteria, Nietzsche might be well called an existentialist. The refusal to belong to any school of thought, the repudiation of the adequacy of any body of beliefs whatsoever, the opposition to philosophic systems, and a marked dissatisfaction with traditional philosophy as superficial, academic, and remote from life. All this is eminently characteristic of Nietzsche no less than of Kierkegaard, Jaspers, or Heidegger, nor could it be argued that this conception of existentialism is generous to the point of being altogether amorphous and meaningless. Clearly, it excludes such relatively more traditional philosophers as, for example, Whitehead or even Russell, let alone the Neo-Thomists, And although positivism and the analytic movement are also in revolt against traditional philosophy, the above description does not fit them. Still, it is possible to be a little more specific about existentialism. There is yet another feature which all but determines the popular image of this movement. Consider the titles of 3 of Kierkegaard's major works: Fear and Trembling, The Concept of Dread, and The Sickness unto Death, which is despair. Death and dread are central in Heidegger's thought, too. Death and failure are crucial in Jasper's, and all of these phenomena are prominent in Sartre's work as well. It is entirely proper to consider the writings of these 4 men as the hard core of existentialism. Kierkegaard introduced the existential. Jasper's entitled one of his main works, Existentialism, and another, smaller volume, Existenzphilosophie. Heidegger's Sein und Zeit is widely taken for the magnum opus of this movement, and Sartre is the only major writer who admits he is an existentialist. If we consider the striking preoccupation with failure, dread, and death, one of the essential characteristics of existentialism, Nietzsche can no longer be included in this movement. The theme of suffering recurs often in his work, and he too concentrates attention on aspects of life which were often ignored in the 19th century, but he makes much less of dread and death than of man's cruelty, resentment, and hypocrisy, of the immorality that struts around masked as morality. It is not the somber and depressed moods that he stresses most, but quite another state of mind which appears even much less often in the literature of the past. A Dionysian joy and exultation that says yes to life, not in a mood of dogged resolution, which is prominent in later German existentialism, but with love and laughter. If we broaden our definition of existentialism to include preoccupation with extreme states of mind, generally it fits Nietzsche too, as well as Rilke, the Dionysian poet. Nevertheless, the difference between Nietzsche's amor fati and the German existentialists is quite considerable, though in many ways French existentialism is much closer to him. Nietzsche's wit, his praise of laughter, and his sparkling prose, now limpid, now like granite, could scarcely be more unlike the vast and solemn tomes of Jasper's or the twilight style of Heidegger. Nor does Kierkegaard, with his more epic and self-conscious humor, writing, in the words of an admirer almost with tongue-in-cheek, equal the devastating, incisive style of Nietzsche. In the story of existentialism, Nietzsche occupies a central place. Jasper's, Heidegger, and Sartre are unthinkable without him, and the conclusion of Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus sounds like a distant echo of Nietzsche. Camus also has written at length about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the first name mentioned in Sartre's philosophic main work, Le Trait et le Néant. Jasper's has written 2 whole books about him and discussed him in detail and several others, and Heidegger, in his later works, considers Nietzsche even more important than Jasper's ever did. As we shall see, however, Heidegger's and Jasper's Nietzsche pictures tell at least as much about the German existentialists as about Nietzsche. Existentialism suggests only a single facet of Nietzsche's multifarious influence, and to call him an existentialist means, in all likelihood, an insufficient appreciation of his full significance. To be sure, his name is linked legitimately with the names of Jasper's, Heidegger, and Sartre, but it is linked no less legitimately with the names of Nikolai Hartmann and Max Scheler, and with Spengler, and with Freud and Adler, and with Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, and with Stephen George no less than with Rilke, and with Shaw and Gide, as well as with Malraux. Almost every one of these writers saw something different in him. Existentialism without Nietzsche would be almost like Thomism without Aristotle, but to call Nietzsche an existentialist is a little like calling Aristotle a Thomist. Just a little philosophy humor. Roman numeral 4, Jasper's. It is in the work of Jasper's that the seed sown by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche first grew into existentialism, or as he prefers to say, existent philosophy. One reason for his opposition to the label existentialism is that it suggests a school of thought, a doctrine, among others, a particular position, even of the term existence philosophy. He once said after using it, "The name is misleading insofar as it seems to restrict. Philosophy can never wish to be less than primordial, eternal philosophy itself. Existent philosophy is meant to be a protest against the betrayal of this primordial and eternal philosopher by the professors who teach philosophy at our modern universities." Nietzsche was occasionally much more caustic than Jaspers about modern scholars. Kierkegaard was even more preoccupied with this theme and more vitriolic, and neither of them as much as approximated Schopenhauer's Führer. In all three cases, however, this opposition was merely incidental to a specific positive purpose. Schopenhauer resented his own failure as a private docent, and the success of Fichte, Schelling, and particularly Hegel, and his positive intent was to obtain a hearing for his own philosophy, which was developed in the world as will and idea. Kierkegaard's central purpose was to persuade modern men that one thing needful was to become a Christian, and he considered philosophy a dangerous distraction, and believed that the professors taught a false conception of Christianity. Nietzsche, too, had, Jaspers notwithstanding, a wealth of positive ideas, and his main objection to the university professors was that, being state employees, they were prone to shirk uncomfortable insights. Philosophers in particular were, Nietzsche claimed, too often motivated by the wish to justify the moral prejudices of society. This fault, he felt, was not confined to the university professors, but came close to being the original sin of philosophy, and his great revolt was aimed not at professors, but at Christianity and Platonism. To Jaspers, the differences between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche seemed much less important than that which they have in common. What mattered most to them does not matter to Jaspers. He dismisses Kierkegaard's forced Christianity no less than Nietzsche's forced anti-Christianity as relatively unimportant. He discounts Nietzsche's ideas as absurdities, and he does not heed Kierkegaard's central opposition to philosophy. All the many philosophers since Hegel and Schelling, however, fare far worse. They are at best instructive, but lack human substance. The original philosophers of the age are Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. The crucial fact for Jaspers is that their thinking was not academically inspired, but rooted in their existence. For Jaspers, any content is secondary, and in his essay on My Philosophy, he can say, as the realization overcame me, at that time, there was no true philosophy at the universities. I thought that facing such a vacuum, even he, who was too weak to create his own philosophy, had the right to hold forth about philosophy, to declare what it once was and what it could be. His own philosophy came only later. The initial impulse of Jaspers' existence philosophy was not a doctrine, but a dissatisfaction with more doctrines, and the conviction that genuine philosophizing must well up from a man's individual existence and address itself to other individuals to help them achieve true existence. The negative aspect of this effort is at first glance clearer than the positive development. For that matter, the negative part alone would be sufficient to ensure the author a considerable following outside the universities, and even among the university professors outside the philosophy departments. In the 1950s, as book after book from Jaspers' pen appeared and found its audience, Von der Vorheit, 1947, with 1,100 pages, came out in a first edition of 5,000 copies. Scarcely any seminar or course of lectures at a German university, not to speak of other countries, dealt with Jaspers. At the very same time, lectures and seminars on Nietzsche were almost as common as courses on Kant and the Greeks, and Heidegger was discussed everywhere. In part, to be sure, this was due to the large number of professorships held by Heidegger's former pupils. It was also due to the character of Jaspers' philosophy. Traditional philosophers from Plato to Nietzsche offered a wealth of ideas and suggestions, theories and doctrines, constructions and analyses which can be expounded by a lecturer or studied and interpreted. Since the death of Hegel, this kind of exposition has come more and more to dominate most courses in philosophy. Consider an outstanding exponent of this approach, Kuno Fischer, who taught philosophy at Heidelberg a generation before Jaspers started teaching there. His 10-volume history of modern philosophy is still famous, and the 2 volumes on Hegel, whom Fischer greatly admired are no worse than the rest. Fisher paraphrases difficult texts, and when they become too difficult, he quotes. Does he understand what he paraphrases? Sometimes. Does he force the reader to think, to share in a common enterprise with Hegel? Does he make us feel like exclaiming, as Hegel did at times, "Oh God, why did you curse me to be a philosopher?" Certainly not. This is how Jaspers himself makes this point. Kuno Fischer is outstanding both by virtue of his rational and clear reproductions, which remain useful, and by virtue of his utter innocence of philosophy itself, which simply cannot be reproduced in this way. In the case of Plato, most readers should see this immediately. Any mere summary would be a travesty of Plato, who wants above all to make his readers think, to make them thoughtful, to stir them up. Indeed, Plato might well have said, as Jesus did, "I am come to kindle a fire on the earth, and what would I rather than it burnt already?" It was neither Hegel nor Plato who first brought this home to Jaspers, but Kierkegaard. Beim Refrain Kierkegaards Birgt eicht das nicht refreibart ist. What is refrain? One of the favorite pastimes of German professors and students. The word is hard to translate, but it means making a report on an author by way of offering a condensed paraphrase, a summary, and outline of his argument. Trying to do this with Kierkegaard, Jaspers discovered that it was impossible. Most American writers on Kierkegaard still have this discovery ahead of them. Jaspers chose Kierkegaard as a model, but with accepting those of his ideas which are easily repeatable. He decided to become unrefrainable too, or to put it differently, he made up his mind to concentrate his efforts on a sustained attempt, indeed, an epic effort, to kindle a fire. Of his 3-volume Philosophie, which is, of all his many books, the one which he himself likes best, he says, any reader who is looking for a doctrine in it is bound to be disappointed, and a reader who wants to remain passive and inert inside is bound to feel empty and let down. These readers must say that I really say nothing. What does not happen in their case is what I have called the beating of the other wing, which is necessary if that which is said in the text as the beating of one wing is to achieve the fulfillment of its meaning and soar up. Any content is a mere means to transcend all content. No statement has been understood until it is seen to be an invitation to be dissatisfied with all statements. Philosophy is given up in favor of philosophizing. The only significant content of philosophizing, however, consists in the impulses, the inner constitution, the way of seeing and judging, the readiness to react by making choices, the immersion in historical presentments, presentness, which grow in us, recognize themselves, and feel confirmed on the way past all objective contents. Being much more modest than Kierkegaard, Jaspers is not in the habit of comparing himself with Socrates, but at this point a comparison is called for. It may seem unfair in principle, worse than comparing a modern sculptor with Michelangelo, for Socrates was not only a philosopher's philosopher, but if ever there was a great human being, it was he. The contrast is meant only to crystallize these 3 problems raised by Jasper's effort. First, Socrates stirred up the youth of Athens simply by being himself. It was, more than anything he said, his character and life that made them feel dissatisfied with their existence and the doctrines others offered. He was an incarnate challenge to their way of life and thinking, an exemplary personality, the embodiment of a new ethic. Insofar as he engaged in philosophy, he did not teach or preach, but relied on dialogue. The content was furnished by his partners, who began by thinking. They had knowledge, and his own function was mainly critical. He liberated others from confusions and a blind trust in untenable beliefs, and incidentally taught them a method. Finally, Socrates never wrote a book. He relied exclusively on close personal contact in which dialogue and character could do their work together. Kierkegaard, who in a few years' time wrote far more books, many pseudonyms, than most serious thinkers ever write, called himself a master of indirect communication. There is an important sense in which Socrates was the master of direct communication par excellence. Jaspers, on the other hand, entrusts his comparable effort to more than 20 books, of which more than a dozen have appeared in the first 10 years after World War II, and there are tomes of 1100, 900, and 700 pages, 2 of almost 500, and another 3 of approximately 350 pages. There is no volume of stories or plays, of memoirs or dialogues among them. The manner is quite unlike either Kierkegaard or Socrates. It is a huge monologue, as it were, a series of lectures, and Jasper's trust in this form of communication continues unabated. His 1100-page book came out as Volume 1, and before completing the Volume 2, he hopes to finish another almost equally ambitious project. In view of this, the question of contents arises much more urgently than in the case of Socrates, or even Kierkegaard, who kept experimenting with a wide variety of literary styles. What is the content of these many books, albeit a content which is not what ultimately matters to the author? Much of the time, Jasper's referiert. He reports what others have said. He passes judgment by way of trying to induce dissatisfaction with the knowledge and the statements and the contents offered us. After his report on the interpretation of dreams, for example, in the fourth completely revised edition of his Allgemeine Psychopathologie, Jaspers concludes, "All in all, it seems to me that in the principles of dream interpretation something right has been hit. My objection is less to the rightness, although the fantasies and frivolities in this area have been endless, than to the importance. After one has become acquainted with the principles and a few cases, one learns hardly anything further. It is a wonderful phenomenon, the dream, but after one's first enthusiasm for its investigation, one must soon confess in disappointment its yield for the knowledge of psychic life remains small after all." A psychoanalyst may feel that this is a little like saying, "Columbus discovered America, so what? In the last analysis, his contribution to our knowledge of the universe was small." Piqued, he might even ask about the importance of Jasper's bulky psychopathology. If this last question, however, were asked not in a spirit of sarcasm, but with a genuine perplexity about the value of such endeavors, Jaspers would not only admit that its yield for the knowledge of psychic life remains small after all, he would even say that this is one of his central points. Later in the same book, another report on Freud concludes somewhat abruptly. "Especially the writings of some of his pupils are, owing to this simplicity, intolerably boring. One always knows in advance that in every work the same is said." Again, Freud's pupils might reply that few judgments could be more applicable to Jaspers himself. The same material is treated over and over again. 3 of his books contain a chapter with a relatively popular exposition of the encompassing, the same judgments concerning Kant and Kierkegaard, and all the great philosophers are repeated in book after book, while his main work on the great philosophers has not yet been completed, and for almost every point, view, or opinion one can choose a formulation from approximately half a dozen places in his writings, if not more, and sometimes the same formulations are repeated. More important by far, the central point is everywhere the same, with the insistence of Ecclesiastes, who, however, confined himself to less than a dozen pages. What seems endless repetition from the outside can be viewed from inside as relentless effort, as tireless attempt to break down modern man's superstitious overconfidence in science, or, no less, theology, or, for that matter, also philosophers who pretend to furnish knowledge. In one of the rare passages in which he mentions Heidegger by name, Jaspers says, late in his Psychopathology, referring to Heidegger's main work, Sein und Zeit, "Notwithstanding the value of his concrete exposition, I consider this attempt in principle the wrong way for philosophy, for it leads those who follow it not to philosophizing, but to the knowledge of a total conception of man's being. The structure of thought does not become an aid for the historically concrete existence of the individual by way of enhancing and confirming the reliable practice of his life, but becomes instead another veil, which is the more fatal because it is precisely with sentences that come closest to existence that real existence is apt to be missed and to become unserious. Heidegger's concern with the man's concrete existence is congenial to Jasper's, but Heidegger's attempt in Sein und Zeit to offer knowledge seems doubly regrettable to Jasper's. As for Heidegger's later writings, Jasper's has long stopped as much as reading them. Heidegger, in turn, considers Jasper's philosophizing and ceaseless transcending as an abdication before that which matters most, and he no longer reads the books of Jasper's. At one time, however, Heidegger sought Jasper's company, and they talked philosophy for days at a time, and some of Jasper's admirers even believe that it was his 3-volume philosophy that induced Heidegger to give up the project of publishing the promised second half of Sein und Zeit. The approach of Heidegger's later works, however, with their open animus against logic and science, and their search, as Jasper's sees it, for an esoteric gnosis or gnosis, is even more distasteful to Jasper's than an overconfidence in scientific knowledge. Jasper's attitude, and indeed that of the other existentialists too, toward one science in particular, deserves special attention: psychology. It was with some justice that Nietzsche asked in the last chapter of his Ecce Homo, "Who among philosophers before me has been a psychologist?" And as we read the notes from Underground, we might well ask, what novelist before Dostoevsky deserves to be called a psychologist? And confronted with Kierkegaard's treatment of original sin in The Concept of Dread, we ask again, what theologian before Kierkegaard was a psychologist? And might not Jasper's ask, who among philosophers before me has been a psychiatrist and a doctor of medicine? And Heidegger might well ask, who among philosophers before me has found it necessary to insist again and again that he offered his major work was not psychology? Sartre, finally, entitles an important chapter of his central philosophic work, Existential Psychoanalysis. Yet this is only half the story. Nietzsche developed detailed psychologic theories which were meant to be based as far as possible on solid evidence. What he wished to offer was science, and he frequently lamented the paucity of observations in this area, the lack of adequate physiological foundations, and the need for planned research. Living as a recluse, he had to base his ideas on self-observation and a few acquaintances, and on his reading, but he did not make a virtue of necessity. In Ecce Homo he remarked, "My genius lies in my nostrils," but he did not think that his nose was a broad enough base for the future of psychology. In Germany, Nietzsche's psychology has been neglected on the whole, together with his interest in science. The only German book on Nietzsche's Psychologische Errungenschaften is by Klages, the characterologist, whose military irrationalism was repudiated even by the Nazis. In general, one pretended that Nietzsche had gone through a positive phase before he returned to his true self by writing Zarathustra, and his psychology was relegated to this middle period by consent of the ignorant, as it were. In fact, Nietzsche's impassioned psychologic interest reaches its climax precisely in his later work. What matters in the present context is that Jaspers and Heidegger, who have written a great deal about him, are not aware of this, and that, decidedly, they do not follow Nietzsche's example. Rather, they go back to Kierkegaard. In Kierkegaard, too, we find a number of psychological insights, though their quantity has often been exaggerated, and they go hand in hand, as already remarked, with self-deception, and still more important, a profound resentment against science. It is interesting that his conception of the existential is developed above all in the concluding unscientific postscript. This bias against science is less interesting in Kierkegaard, whose central problem was, as he himself said, to become a Christian, than in German existentialism. It is very outspoken in Heidegger, much more subtle in Jasper's. There are many passages in Jasper's writings where he strongly recommends a thorough study of at least one science, but his motivation is the very opposite of Nietzsche's, who might well have said that a good background in psychology is indispensable for a worthwhile work in ethics or aesthetics, or some other branches of philosophy. What Jaspers wants us to discover is the limits of all science. Only then shall we be ready for Existenzphilosophy. Like many other German philosopher, and above all Heidegger, Jaspers almost seems to feel that psychology is a bad word, just as the reputation of a German thinker demands that the French do not understand him. Witness what Gounod has done with Goethe's Faust, and Sartre with German philosophy. It would apparently impair his profundity if what he did were mere psychology. Nietzsche was an exception in both respects, and insisted that the French understood him much better than the Germans. Looking back on his relatively early Psychologie der Weltanschauung, Jaspers criticizes it, not in Nietzsche's spirit, for being as yet insufficiently scientific. On the contrary, it was hidden philosophy that here misunderstood itself as an objectively descriptive psychology. To be sure, his work had not been descriptive only, but hortatory too. His descriptions had been strongly colored by his valuations, and no sensitive reader could miss the author's earnest appeal that we repudiate some attitudes and model ourselves on others. What is so striking is that Jaspers is inclined to discount his often interesting analysis as really philosophic, while he evidently set store by his hortations, or as he himself prefers to say, his Existenzerhellung and Appellierien. The attempt to illuminate the reader about this condition, in the sense of condition humane, and to appeal to him to face it with as much nobility as he can muster. Something of the sort may also be found in Spinoza's Ethics, or in Nietzsche, or in Socrates or Kant. Indeed, all the great philosophers said also, among other things, to use the words of Rilke, "You must change your life." Mary Oliver said it too. Two things, however, set Jaspers apart from all the great philosophers, from Socrates to Nietzsche. First, the accent is reversed. They were chiefly preoccupied with highly theoretical analysis, and they set store by their success in these, and it was only indirectly that they challenged us to change our lives. Second, the chief respect in which they challenged us to change was to become more analytical, reflective, critical, and few would have hesitated to say rational. Jaspers is far from being anti-rational. Under no circumstances would he have us defy reason, but unlike the great philosophers of the past, he insists that the rational sphere is sub-philosophic, and that philosophy begins only where reason fails us, or, in Jasper's phrase, has suffered shipwreck. In one of the most fascinating books ever written by one philosopher about another, Jaspers adduces hundreds of quotations from Nietzsche, without distinguishing between what is early and what is late, between what Nietzsche himself published and what his sister fished out of his wastebasket, and Jaspers is never content until he has also found the contradiction with this amazing and assuredly unscientific method which defies the canons of philology and history. All of Nietzsche's definite ideas, theories, and arguments are easily dissolved, and he is finally reduced to Jasper's conception of him. Endless reflection, sounding out and questioning everything, digging without reaching a new foundation, except in new absurdities. In another passage, in another book, Jaspers also dismisses Nietzsche's conclusions wholesale as a pile of absurdities and vacuities. The fact is, of course, that these conclusions are never presented or experienced as conclusions of an argument, but of a development of a concrete human being, but as so many quotations on file cards, which can be shuffled and juxtaposed at will. If he considers Nietzsche's conclusions absurd and empty, why has Jaspers written 2 books about Nietzsche and referred to him at length in other books? Because the effect achieved by Jaspers' method is, as Jaspers sees it, quite invaluable. Out of every position one may have adopted, i.e., out of every finitude, we are expelled. We are set whirling. Reason suffers shipwreck, and is thus prepared for true philosophizing. Jaspers' characterization of all true philosophizing is eminently applicable to the effect at which he aimed in his big book on Nietzsche. It loosens us from the fetters of determinate thinking, not by abandoning such thinking, but by pushing it to its limits. The plunge from the rigidities which were deceptive, after all, turns into the ability to stay in suspense, which what seemed abyss becomes the space of freedom. The seeming nothing turns into that from which true being speaks to us, with its complete disregard for the dates of his myriad quotations or their context, with its studied failure to pay heed to the development of Nietzsche's thought either over the years or even in specific arguments. Jaspers' book, however stimulating and deeply disturbing, makes its subtitle a mockery. Introduction to the Understanding of His Philosophizing. A far fairer estimate is found toward the end of Jaspers' essay on his own philosophy, included in this volume, where he says, "My Nietzsche was to be an introduction to that shaking up of thought from which existence philosophy must spring." Jaspers is surely far closer to Kierkegaard than to Nietzsche. In Jaspers' existence philosophy, Kierkegaard's revolt against Hegelianism reaches its philosophic climax. Jaspers must be understood less as the heir of Nietzsche than as the antipode of Kuno Fischer. Am I right, y'all? The protest against Hegel's avowed aim to raise philosophy to the level of a science leads to a philosophizing which is personal to the point of repudiating all content in favor of an appeal to man's inner constitution. The opposition to the Hegelian professors for whom philosophy was system and history of philosophy, and in both aspects a species of objective knowledge, leads to the tireless insistence that philosophic truth is subjectivity, to cite the faithful paradox of Kierkegaard. The Hegelian principle that any judgment must be meditated and developed is abandoned, and judgments are offered abruptly and apparently dogmatically, but labeled as subjective. Conviction and conscience are reinstated in their immediacy. Communication is made central, as in Kierkegaard, but Jaspers' books, possibly even more than Kierkegaard's, have the appearance of a vast monologue, or, to point up what is common to both men, a sermon. Jaspers says communication, but means hortation, homily, appeal. Of any real openness for another point of view, let alone a Hegelian immersion in it, there is scarcely a trace in Jaspers' work, whether he construes Nietzsche or censures Schelling, devoting a whole book to each, or attacks Bultmann, the existentialist theologian. The controversy has been published in another book. He always operates from a fixed base of moral integrity and passes moral sentence, in his revolt against the objectivity of Hegel's internal criticism. Jaspers offers strictures which remain completely external to the positions judged, not satisfied with such external philosophic criticisms, if that is not in fact a contradiction in terms. Jaspers usually begins or ends with an examination of his adversary's character. Nietzsche allegedly lacked a capacity for friendship. Schelling lacked a noble soul, and Jaspers doubts the substance of his first marriage, and the critique of Bultmann ends with a critical profile of Bultmann's spiritual personality. Jaspers says that truth begins zu sein in a situation where there are two human beings. He insists that I must constantly doubt my own position. He speaks of a loving fight, and he writes and lectures about the philosophic practice of life. It may be urged as an internal criticism that his practice we find little of all this, that in his practice we find little of all this. He does not consider other points of view on the same level with his own. He does not risk his position by exposing it to the perspective of another. We do not witness a loving fight, but the proceedings in a court of law. Like most skeptics, but unlike Nietzsche, Jaspers brings his omnivorous doubt to a stop before the fortress of his moral principles. It may be because he feels that Nietzsche's philosophizing was in fact quite different from his own, that Jaspers in his 70s has come to the conclusion that Kierkegaard was really far greater than Nietzsche. Surely Kierkegaard envisaged his own mission as a completely hortatory, called attention to the supra-rational and urged us to soar above reason. Surely Kierkegaard envisaged his own mission as completely hortatory, called attention to the supra-rational, and urged us to soar above reason. 5. Heidegger. Martin Heidegger has arrived at the opposite evaluation. In his later writings, he dismisses Kierkegaard as merely a religious writer, and he devotes more and more attention to the works of Nietzsche, whom he has come to consider one of the very greatest philosophers of all time, and alas, the last great metaphysician of the West. This conception, first developed at length in a noteworthy essay on Nietzsche's word God is dead, is of course diametrically opposed to Jaspers, but like Jaspers, it is supported by a great many quotations and depends on a complete disregard for the context, both of the quotations and of Nietzsche's overall development and thought. It may seem that their historical interpretations are not really important. After all, Bertrand Russell's philosophical importance is quite independent of the many caricatures he has drawn in his witty but unreliable History of Western Philosophy. There are some important differences. First, Jaspers and Heidegger are in this instance not, as Russell often is, unfair to an opponent, but they deal with a man whom they consider the greatest philosopher of his time, and more than that, a revolutionary who, as both men see it, has changed the whole climate of modern thought, making it imperative for us today to begin our philosophic efforts in relation to him. Secondly, Jaspers maintains, all knowledge is interpretation. The procedure in understanding texts is a simile for all comprehension of being, and Heidegger's philosophy has increasingly turned from an attempt to comprehend being directly into a series of efforts to comprehend it by way of interpretations of selected texts. Under these circumstances, the deeply unscientific nature of Jaspers and Heidegger's interpretations certainly deserves the utmost emphasis. In their elaborate Nietzsche interpretations, Jaspers and Heidegger demonstrate with a tremendous show of learning opposite conclusions. In his Nietzsche image, each of them has drawn his own portrait as his rival sees him. In Heidegger's eyes, Jaspers is as inconclusive as Nietzsche, philosophizing endlessly without ever evolving a philosophy. To Jaspers in turn, it seems that Heidegger, who began by using terms that look existential, and who once spoke with an existential pathos, is really a metaphysician like his Nietzsche. Yet each sees himself in a very different light as offering a new beginning where Nietzsche left off. Jaspers with his Existenz philosophy, Heidegger with his overcoming of metaphysics. Heidegger's and Jasper's opposite evaluations of the relative stature of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard further illuminate the gulf that separates the two men who are generally lumped together, much against their will, as existentialists. Heidegger disdained the openly hortatory tone. Hortatory tone. Is that hoity-toity? Is hortatory? So much so that some of his readers fail to notice altogether that he too appeals to us to change our lives. Heidegger's enthusiastic exhortations immediately after Hitler came to power that the students and professors at the German university must now think in the service of the Nazi state. His inaugural address as rector at Freiburg has been printed, are a very noteworthy exception. His inaugural address as rector at Freiburg has been printed, are a very noteworthy exception. His flair for the most intricate terminology and what in Sein und Zeit looks almost like a subtle system has reminded many students of scholasticism and his originally Catholic background. An early disciple, that distinguished colleague, on the other hand, would sum up Heidegger's importance by asserting that he introduced Nietzsche into philosophy. Without Heidegger, that is the surely false suggestion, Nietzsche would still be considered a mere literary figure. To put the matter differently, by being so exceedingly difficult and scholastic, Heidegger made discussion of death and despair and dread and care and other previously unacademic subjects quite respectable. He made it possible for professors to discuss with a good conscience matters previously considered literary, if that. The question is how well Heidegger himself has dealt with these phenomena and others. His detractors see him as an obscurantist whose involved constructions, with their multiple plays on words, conceal a mixture of banalities and falsehoods. His admirers say that he has shown the temporality of man's existence, that he strikes new paths by raising the questions of being, and that he is the great anti-Cartesian who has overcome the fatal bifurcation of matter and mind and the isolation of the thinking self. His critics in turn retort that his last feat is common to most modern philosophers, and with Heidegger, unlike some of the others, achieved it only by renouncing Descartes' rule that we must think as clearly and distinctly as the mathematicians. This, say his admirers, leads to positivism. What is wanted is a new way of thinking. Heidegger himself, at least in his written work, tends to lump together followers and critics as having failed completely to understand Sein und Zeit, and early work on which his reputation largely rests. In 1949, a little more than 20 years after the publication of Being and Time, he writes, "Philosophy could hardly have given a clearer demonstration of the power of this oblivion of being than it has furnished us by the somnambulistic assurance with which it has passed by the real and only question of being and time. What is at stake here is therefore not a series of misunderstandings of a book, but our abandonment by being." The same assurance speaks out of Heidegger's letter on humanism, published in 1947. It is widely supposed that the attempt made in Being and Time ended in a dead-end street, for the book was subtitled First Half, and the sequel was never published. Let us not bother about this opinion, Heidegger continues, until today thought, which, Being in Time, attempted a few steps, has not advanced at all beyond this treatise. Since Being in Time, Heidegger has mostly published interpretations. First, a book on Kant, widely repudiated by Kant scholars, then interpretations of poems by Hölderlin, eventually collected in a volume, and in between an essay on Plato, which pictures his doctrine of truth as a fateful innovation which allegedly comes to an end in Nietzsche. Today we must attempt a new beginning with the help of a new understanding of the pre-Socratics, even as Jaspers is trying to crown his life's work with a tome on the great philosophers, including Jesus and the Buddha, among many others. Heidegger hopes to complete a major work on the pre-Socratics. Some of his reinterpretations have by now appeared in various places, notably a 48-page essay on Anaximander's one surviving sentence. But, at least so far, the classical philologists, including even those who yield to none in their respect for being in time, priding themselves on being friends and former pupils, are agreed that his interpretations are untenable. Even so, some who know their Kant are awed by the erudition of his classical interpretations. Nietzsche scholars find his Rilke essay stimulating and profound, and Rilke scholars bow before his Nietzsche exegesis. What has provoked far more controversy than anything else, he has written in the growing body of his self-interpretations. Most of his old pupils who felt close to him in the period of being and time insist, though for the most part not in print, that he did not mean what he now explains he meant. Some are altogether embarrassed by his later work and confine their admiration to being and time, and such other relatively early essays as, for example, What is Metaphysics? The differences between Heidegger and Schelling are unquestionably much more striking than the similarities, but these few parallels are of some interest. Above all, there are two Heideggers as once there were two Schellings, the early and the late one. In both cases, the late philosophy has esoteric, if not mystic, touches, and is supported by the most tremendous sense of a historic mission. Unlike Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, who felt that it was given to them to bring an end to a long and remarkable development, Heidegger claims, as Schelling did, that he is making a new start, and that with him a new age is beginning. Moreover, Heidegger's famous question, "Why is there any being at all, and not rather nothing?" raised in 1929 in What is Metaphysics, and again in the longer Introduction to Metaphysics, the question of which he conceded in 1949 that it might seem that the metaphysician Leibniz had asked it before, was repeatedly raised as a basic question by Schelling, as Jaspers points out at length in a late work on Schelling published 1955. One of the points on which Heidegger and Jaspers are agreed is that since Sartre is an avowed existentialist, they do not care to be called by the same name. Even so, their reasons are different. Jasper's main reason, which would be decisive in itself, is that the word suggests a doctrine, among others, shaped by a group among other groups. Secondly, his moral censure of Schelling and Freud suggests that he does not approve of Sartre's spiritual personality, and even less of that of the Paris existentialist as the popular image pictures him. Moreover, Sartre makes a great deal of his debt to Heidegger without acknowledging that he has learned from Jaspers, which would seem to be a great deal. What he has learned from Jaspers, which would seem to be a great deal. Sartre even dismisses Jaspers in print as a professed Catholic, while in fact Jaspers is a Protestant who has developed into a non-denominational proponent of biblical religion. Heidegger's reasons for insisting that he is not an existentialist are set forth in detail in his letter on humanism, which was prompted indirectly by Sartre's famous lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. Sartre's lecture is included in the present volume, unabridged. Heidegger says, in part, Sartre formulates the basic principle of existentialism in these words: existence precedes essence. Here he uses the terms existentia and essentia in the old sense of metaphysics, which says, since Plato, the essentia precedes the existentia. Sartre reverses this sentence, but the reversal of a metaphysical sentence remains a metaphysical sentence, being such a sentence it remains, like all metaphysics, in the oblivion of the truth of being. And Heidegger concludes, the main principle of Sartre about the priority of existentia over essentia certainly justifies the name existentialism as a title which is appropriate for this philosophy. By the same token, the label is inappropriate for Heidegger's philosophy, which, as he emphasizes again and again in his later works, was from the outset concerned with being. Even in Being and Time, human existence, das Dasein, was discussed at length only as the mode of being best knowable by us, And throughout the book, Heidegger kept reminding even his first readers that his interest was not in man as such, not, as he put it repeatedly, anthropological. On the contrary, he called his effort even then fundamental ontology. And ontology, of course, is the study of being, not of man's existence. Traditional ontology, however, did not get beyond the study of beings as such, while Heidegger hoped to penetrate to being itself. Originally, he tried to do this by way of an analysis of man's existence, which was timely, made him fashionable overnight, and gave thousands the impression that Heidegger had brought philosophy down to earth. In his later writings, the very violence he does to language suggests to a new generation that he is trying to say something new. And to use one of Rilke's favorite words, unsaglitch, something extreme and unsayable. Heidegger's preoccupation with the roots of words, which results in false etymologies and plays on words, according to his critics, gives his followers the feeling that he is going to the roots, while others remain at the surface. His critique of all traditional philosophy from Plato to Nietzsche, his insistence that all modern philosophic thinking is vitiated by Latin mistranslations of Greek words, and the demand that we must now cover the original experience of the earliest Greek thinkers, going back to the beginnings, communicates a sense of radicalism and occasionally even the excitement of an archaeological excavation. As layer upon layer of misunderstanding is exposed, the reader feels that something glorious is about to come to view. Alas, it usually remains about to come to view. It is as if night had fallen when Heidegger himself is at last ready to translate the dicta of the pre-Socratics. The great discovery is made, but we cannot quite see it, not because his version looks like what we knew before, it does not, but because it is so very dark. More often even Heidegger employs such phrases as set out on the way, or try to reach the point from which the question can one day be asked. No archaeologist, of course, can avoid this preliminary search for a good site. Heidegger, like Schliemann and Sir Arthur Evans, enlists the help of poets, which adds to the excitement and makes his later works, for all their frequent obscurity, no less unacademic compared to most philosophy than was Being and Time. His favorite poet, to be sure, is not Homer, whose laughter rings through the ages as he relates the foibles of the gods, but Holderlin, the dark poet whose splendid rhythms carry ordinary readers over vast abysses of obscurity. Some of his last verse, still of hymnic power, even bears the stamp of madness, and was written after brief confinement in an asylum, before insanity destroyed his powers altogether. Holderlin's schizophrenia certainly does not disprove his competence as a guide for a philosopher. It is irrelevant from a logical point of view, and yet symptomatic. It underlines Heidegger's deliberate defiance of common sense and his recourse not merely to what is extraordinary, but, and here we find a striking similarity with a great deal of modern fiction, to what is pathological. No philosopher should be viewed only in the context of his time, against the background of contemporary art and literature. But to see him also, briefly, in this context is, no doubt, legitimate. So viewed, Heidegger belongs to the contemporary revolt against representation, even as modern prose and painting are no longer satisfied with the representation of events or things. Heidegger feels that time has come for philosophy to break with what he calls representational thinking. His partisans occasionally counter criticisms, saying that they presuppose the competence of common sense or logic, and their voices show the scorn with which a critic of Picasso might be told that he is a mere Philistine. What Heidegger proposes to put in the place of representational thinking he calls das Andenkende Denken. Das Andenkende Denken, a thinking that recalls. This translation has its own enthusiastic approval. We must try to remember and call back what is forgotten, being, not beings, not mere objects, but that of which we are a part. The method which he recommends is to recall what has been thought, instead of thoughtlessly assuming that we know it all, or that in view of modern progress the beginnings have long been surpassed. On the contrary, our common sense is alienated from the source of our being, and we must enlist the aid of uncommon creation, such as, for example, hymns by Holderlin, or the later and obscure verses of Rilke, which he esteems less than Holderlin's, or possibly a Sophoclean chorus. To note that Heidegger's interpretations are unscientific might be said to beg the question if Jasper's interpretations are not tenable historically and philologically. That is a defect by his own explicit standards and can be held against him as an inescapable internal criticism. But Heidegger does not claim to be scientific. On the contrary, if Nietzsche's scorn of the belly of being is applicable to some of Heidegger's later speculations, and his being is the shadow of God and a post-Christian afterworld, there is at least one further image of Nietzsche's, Zarathustra, of which Heidegger reminds us, a characterization which helps us to explain his wide appeal. You, the bold seekers and tempters, and whoever embarks with cunning sails on terrible seas, you, drunk with riddles, glad of the twilight, whose soul flutes lure astray to every whirlpool, because you do not want to grope along a thread with cowardly hand, and where you can guess, you hate to deduce. 6. Sartre. It is mainly through the work of Jean-Paul Sartre that existentialism has come to the attention of a wide international audience. Even Heidegger's great prestige in Germany after the Second World War is due, in no small part, to his tremendous impact on French thought. Nevertheless, Sartre is widely considered a mere littérateur. And in the 1950s, it has become much more fashionable to criticize him, or rather dismiss him, than to take him seriously, let alone to praise him. Oddly, it is widely urged against him that he is in some way strikingly unacademic, as if academic existentialism were not a contradiction in terms. Sartre's writings bear the stamp of his experience from the outset. In 1938 he lays down his experience of the 30s in La Nercée. No reader can fail to notice that it is his own experience, not mere cerebration. In 1939, on the eve of the war, he prints 5 stories, including The Wall and The Long Childhood of a Leader, which fuse existentialist motifs with an agonized awareness of the moral existentialist issues of the period and a wealth of psychologic observations rarely equaled since the Notes from Underground. The strictly philosophic writings of that period are still rather academic, being exercises in the phenomenology of Husserl, though it is characteristic that the subject of these exercises is emotion. In the war, Sartre becomes a soldier fighting against Hitler, is captured, returns to Paris, and fights in the resistance. It was of the experience of these years that his philosophic chef d'oeuvre was born. Chef de... like hors d'oeuvre. Chef d'oeuvre. L'être et le néant, and Sartre's comments on commitment and decision, dread and death are charged with life. It is often said that he accepted all these themes from Heidegger and that his thought is second-hand. Yet Heidegger's treatment of the same themes is, more often than not, abstract to the point of being neither evident in Husserl's or Husserl's sense, nor even plausible. We are aware of the relations between words which had the same roots, but much less clear about the connections between the phenomena which he describes. The thought process seems determined by the words. In Sartre's work, too, there are many highly abstract pages, and at times he is misled by words and writes what is no longer meaningful. Yet many of his pages on the central themes of existentialism have the plausibility and contact with experience which are lacking in the similar analyses of Heidegger. Sartre's attitude toward psychology differs strikingly from Heidegger's and Jasper's. He has no fear of being taken for a man who writes psychology, and he does not consider it sub-philosophical to base discussions of despair, decision, dread, and self-deception on experience. He does not upbraid Freud for presenting brutalizing demands, Jasper's, nor does he insist that his own discussion has nothing to do with psychology or psychoanalysis, Heidegger. Sartre attacks Freud on specific grounds. His attack is, rather characteristically, less than gracious. He writes as if it were a well-known fact that there are two schools of psychoanalysis, Freud's and Sartre's. He calls the latter existential psychoanalysis, and he contrasts them without emphasizing which came earlier in time. It has never been the forte of philosophers to acknowledge their debts. Sartre is a philosopher in the French tradition, which, more often than not, has produced men who stand at the borderline of philosophy and literature. Montaigne, Pascal, Voltaire, Rousseau, and even Bergson come to mind in this connection. As in most of these cases, it would be beside the point to speculate how much space he will receive in future histories of philosophy. Undoubtedly, he will be remembered, not least for his unprecedented versatility. He is much more interesting than most of his contemporaries, whether he writes short stories or novels, essays or philosophy or plays or literary criticism. So much sass. In most of these respects, as well as in temperament, Sartre is much closer to Nietzsche than to German existentialism. Not the least thing he shares with Nietzsche is the multiplicity of styles that gives expression to new experience of life and a new vision of man, dazzling variety that is still one at heart. Sartre is no mere virtuoso. There is a common core in his multifarious writings. Probably the short story The Wall is the best introduction to the heart of Sartre's thought, even as, despite its ending, it is above comparison with O. Henry. It is also, despite its style, far richer than the short stories of Hemingway. It is a classic treatment of the central existentialist motif of confrontation with death and contains important themes which can be found, too, in some of his other works. For example, in the two plays Les Mains Sales, translated as Dirty Hands or Red Gloves, and more obviously, Les Morts Sans Sepulture, The Victors. In these works, man's highest value is integrity, and Sartre goes out of his way to point up to its utter independence of social utility. What? In these works, man's highest value is integrity, and Sartre goes out of his way to point up its utter independence of social utility. Here another similarity to Nietzsche may be noted. The value of a human being, Nietzsche said, does not lie in his usefulness, for it would continue to exist even if there were nobody to whom he could be useful. The value of Nietzsche's man is highly complex, while Sartre's insistence on integrity may seem relatively simple. A closer comparison, however, shows that the features Nietzsche stressed are found in Sartre too, if less explicitly: passion and its mastery, independent of convention, and that creative freedom which find ultimate expression in being a law unto itself. What Sartre has probably learnt from Heidegger is that all this can be achieved by simply facing up to death, but he has not learnt it in the way hundreds of Heidegger's followers learned from him by reading him and then repeating his quaint formulations. On the contrary, when we compare Sartre and Heidegger, it generally seems as if Sartre had written from experience what in Heidegger seemed relatively academic and abstract. One of the central ideas in this chapter is encountered in Jasper's writings long before Sartre's book appeared in 1943. The contrast of man's facticity and transcendence, for example, near the end of section 6 of the lecture on the encompassing, which is included in this volume. Sartre is not as utterly unfair to Freud as Jasper's was when he wrote in 1931, "The self-reflection of the human being of integrity, which had culminated in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, has here degenerated into the uncovering of sexual desires and typical childhood experiences. It is the covering up of genuine, dangerous self-reflection by a mere rediscovery of already known types." Yet the very same theme, including even Jasper's charge that psychoanalysis somehow implies that man should return back to nature, which no longer requires him to be human, is taken up in Sartre's analysis of self-deception. But what in Jasper's writings sound didactic, moralistic, and abstract, a solemn sermon quite remote from Freud's explicit statements, comes to life in Sartre's pages. Freud's attack on self-deception is quite apt to lead to self-deception on a different level. We face our repressions and see ourselves as victims of the censor, or our parents. Having read Sartre, we understand Jasper's and Heidegger better. It is as if he must have come first and their more abstract treatments later. In fact, it was Nietzsche who came first to write of faith and self-deception, of the last man and the overman, and then Jaspers and Heidegger dealt with similar topics, writing like professors, expounding despair and death and the attempt to know oneself in terms of quaint big words, and 1 to 3, and even Roman 3, Arabic 2, small b. Sartre, in his cafe, alas, sees the waiter playing at being a waiter, and feels that he himself must play at being a professor of philosophy. He makes a point of knowing such professional philosophers as Heidegger, Husserl, and Hegel, to whom he pays homage, and he even mentions Professor Scheller in connection with the Man of Resentment, rather than referring to Nietzsche, whom Scheller, of course, had read. The pity of it is that Sartre clothes his analysis in spurious dialectic. He speaks of the nothing, like Heidegger, takes in itself and for itself from Hegel, and above all plays on the word being in a way that veils his meaning from most readers, while am nothing but are apt to feel, while the few who recognize his systemic confusion of am and am nothing but are apt to feel that this invalidates his whole analysis, which it does not. The in soi in itself, in Sartre's thought, the en soi in itself is in Sartre's thought the being which rests in itself, the being of such things as tables. The por soi for itself is that being which is aware of itself, man. Its structure is different from that of the en soi, and the phenomenon of the self-deception serves the author as a clue. What must the por soi be like in order to make self-deception possible? The form of this question is reminiscent of both Kant and Heidegger, and it is at least questionable whether this transcendental mold does not do violence to Sartre's thoughts. Does he explain, for example, how it is possible for a man to deceive himself to the point of believing that he has done some specific thing which in fact he has not done? Does his account explain how one can persuade oneself that one has not done what in fact one has done? At the very least, however, Sartre argues in a manner which invites such questions. He thinks on a level where discussion is possible. His thought provokes discussion, and is offered, as it were, as part of a discussion. It may well be the most crucial flaw of German existentialism that, all protestations to the contrary notwithstanding, it is essentially a monologue. Either a language is constructed within which important criticisms are possible, and questions not put in this language are dismissed as common sense, naive, positivistic, and in any case not philosophical, or the mode of utterance is homiletic. In either case, it is oracular, and it is one of Sartre's greatest virtues that his style of thought is not. What makes self-deception possible, according to Sartre, is that the por soi differs from the en soi, or to be concrete, A man is not a homosexual, a waiter, or a coward in the same way in which he is 6 feet tall or blond, if it were merely a matter of one's being, and not only a waiter or a homosexual, and of one's character not being exhausted by that fact, and some of Sartre's paradoxical assertions look as if this were his only point. It could be retorted that it is no less true that a man is not a 6-footer and nothing else. The crux of the matter is suggested by such words as possibility, choice, and decision. If I am 6 feet tall, that is that. It is a fact, no less, than that the table is, say, 2 feet high. Being a coward or a waiter, however, is different. It depends on ever new decisions. I may say, I must leave now, or I am that way, because I am a waiter or a coward, as if being a waiter or a coward were a brute fact. Actually, this apparent statement of fact veils a decision. This theme is elaborated further and without forbidding terminology in Sartre's portrait of the anti-Semite. Here Sartre tries to show that a man is not an anti-Semite the way he is blonde. He chooses to be an anti-Semite, says Sartre, because he is afraid of freedom, openness, and change, and longs to be as solid as a thing. He wants an identity. He wants to be something in the manner in which a table is something or a rock. At the outset, perhaps, he plays at being an anti-Semite, but when it has become second nature, the man has achieved nothing less than an escape from freedom. He has abdicated his humanity. Sartre does not deduce his portrait from an a priori philosophy. The observations which are here distilled into an essay are found 4 years after L'Être et le Néant in The Childhood of a Leader, which he published in the same volume with The Wall. In the English-speaking world, Sartre's lecture on existentialism is probably his best-known work. This is rather unfortunate because it is, after all, only an occasional lecture which, though brilliant and vivid in places and unquestionably worthy of attention, bears the stamp of the moment. It contains unnecessary misstatements of fact as well as careless and untenable arguments and a definition of existentialism which has been repudiated by Jaspers and Heidegger and ought to be repudiated by Sartre too, because it is no less unfair to his own thought. By now it has become a commonplace that existentialism is the doctrine that existence precedes essence, and this phrase obstructs the understanding of this complex movement as well as of Sartre's philosophy. Even his explanation of the meaning of this definition invites hosts of criticisms, and the same is also true of his arguments a little later in the lecture for a somewhat Kantian ethic. Oddly, perhaps, enough good things remain to warrant reading and rereading. The intention of this lecture was to offer a defense of Sartre's thought against some criticisms which appeared important to him at the time in 1946. 10 years later, the objections to Sartre have become a little different, at least in the United States. They serve as a pretext for a rather cavalier treatment of his thought which is discounted, not examined. It is for this reason that a few irreverent objections which stand in the way of serious criticism may be briefly noted and rebutted. The first, most common, and least serious point is that he writes, or sometimes has written, in a cafe, and deals rather too much with sex. An English reviewer remarked that his 5 short stories leave Lady Chatterley's lover sleeping at the doorpost, and an American publisher has placed this invitation on the cover of a paperback edition. In his philosophic main work, too, he deals with sex, and another American publisher has brought out a translation of some of this material ahead of the rest of the book. Sartre's treatment of sex, however, whether in fiction or philosophy, is designed to increase our understanding of important problems, never to arouse desire. As for the cafe, most philosophers today probably write in a den, which Sartre did not have when he returned from fighting Hitler, and his room was not heated while the cafe was. But Socrates pursued philosophy in the marketplace, which is not feasible in a northern climate, the less if you want to write. For a philosopher with a keen concern for psychological observation, moreover, a cafe may be much better than a den. Secondly, it is a widespread assumption in the United States that an avowed atheist is eo ipso no philosopher,
This view is founded on the long association of philosophy and theology in American colleges and blinks the fact that for over 150 years the most important philosophers have been pantheists, atheists, or agnostics, and that in English philosophy God has played scarcely any part at all since Bishop Berkeley assigned a rather odd role to him early in the 18th century. The British philosophers, however, do not usually make a point of their disbelief, while Sartre does, and his un-British insistence on the relevance of ideas to life makes him doubly suspect. Therefore, it is well to keep in mind that perhaps the most compassionate and venerable of all mortals, the Buddha, also made a point of his lack of belief, and for essentially the same reason as Sartre. The differences between the two men could scarcely be more striking, even though the Buddha stressed despair and suffering no less than the existentialists. It would be folly to paint Sartre in the image of the Buddha. He is not saintly, but aggressively human. He does not preach disenchantment, but commitment to the world. Like Nietzsche, Sartre remains faithful to the earth and says, life begins on the other side of despair. Few men could be more unlike each other. Nevertheless, the Buddha, too, opposed any reliance on the divine because he wanted men to realize their complete responsibility. His final and perhaps most characteristic words, according to tradition, were, work out your own salvation with diligence. And if the diligence is rather uncharacteristic of the existentialists, the Buddha's still more radical dictum with which the Dhammapada opens is nothing less than the quintessence of Sartre's thought. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. Few words in world literature equal the impact of this saying. All man's alibis are unacceptable. No gods are responsible for his condition. No original sin, no heredity, and no environment, no race, no caste, no father, and no mother, no wrong-headed education, no governess, no teacher, not even an impulse or a disposition, a complex or a childhood trauma. Man is free, but his freedom does not look like the glorious liberty of the Enlightenment. It is no longer the gift of God. Once again, man stands alone in the universe, responsible for his condition, likely to remain in a lowly state, but free to reach above the stars. Toward the end of L'Être et le Néant, Sartre argues that it is man's basic wish to fuse his openness and freedom with the impermeability of things, to achieve a state of being in which the en soi and pour soi are synthesized. This ideal, says Sartre, one can call God, and man is the being who wants to be God. The chapter ends, but the idea of God is contradictory. Man is a useless passion. Man's situation, as Sartre sees it, is absurd and tragic. But does that rule out integrity, nobility, or valor, or the utmost effort? In its limitation to this one life, Sartre's image of the human situation differs radically from the Buddhist view, in which life follows on life and salvation remains always possible. Sartre's world is closer to Shakespeare's. There are situations in which, whatever choice we make, we cannot escape guilt. This is Jasper's view, too. Secular existentialism is a tragic worldview without, however, being pessimistic. Even in guilt and failure, man can retain his integrity, witness the wall, and defy the world. There remains a final objection, which concerned not only Sartre, but Heidegger and Jaspers too. Have they themselves retained their integrity in view of their political behavior? The very critics who would be the first to make a point of the vulgarity of the preceding charges have most frequently pressed this point. In the case of other philosophers, it might be irrelevant to introduce their politics and morals, but Sartre has said, and Heidegger and Jaspers have said much the same. Existentialism must be lived to be really sincere. To live as an existentialist means to be ready to pay for this view, and not merely to lay it down in books. The first point to note is that existentialism clearly does not entail one specific political program, and the fact that the three leading existentialists followed divergent paths during the Hitler years is not surprising in itself, and yet it does not follow that all three were equally in keeping with their writings. Heidegger, who in Sein und Zeit had spoken much of resolutely facing death, joined the Nazis after Hitler came to power, and as rector of his university, delivered in an inaugural address which, fortunately for him, is not widely read. If as he now says he soon abandoned Nazism, it is the more remarkable that his resolve was kept so quiet that even today many remain unconvinced. Jaspers, with a Jewish wife, made the decision to keep quiet, but was ready once again in 1945 to speak of guilt and shipwreck, dread, and death. It is surely exceedingly polite to say, though their voices be the voices of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, their lives are the lives of Kant and Hegel. Sartre, back from the war, fought in the resistance that is often forgotten today. But what is not forgotten is his more recent decision to make common cause with the Communist Party in France. In the United States, this is held against him more than anything else. His decision is utterly quixotic. Unlike Heidegger in 1933, Sartre derives no advantage from it whatsoever. Moreover, he himself insists that he is not a communist, that he cannot accept the doctrines of the party, and that he knows that his head would soon fall off if they should come to power. It is his impassioned opposition to the status quo, and his conviction that the communists, but not the socialists, are serious about overthrowing it, that leads him to believe that he must, for the present, make a common front with them. Unconsciously, he reminds us of a lesson we learnt from the Greeks, from Plato in particular, that philosophical profundity and political sense do not always go together. On the contrary, John Locke illustrates the same point from the other side, so does John Stuart Mill. Radicalism is sometimes eminently fruitful in philosophy, while political good sense and probably inseparable from moderation, compromise. Radicalism is sometimes eminently fruitful in philosophy, while political good sense is probably inseparable from moderation, compromise, and patience. Existentialism has developed no political philosophy, and the so-called existentialists have made widely different political decisions. If we recall Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, the variety would increase even further, though perhaps no more than in the case of Thomists. Some have compromised themselves, and some have not. None of them can simply be dismissed on that score, and Sartre is unquestionably one of the most interesting thinkers of our time. 7. A story with a moral. The movement we have followed through more than 100 years is not confined to Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky's notes, and Nietzsche, Jaspers, Heidegger, and Sartre. There is Rilke, whose later verse has left a deep impression on the thought of Heidegger, while his prose work, the notes of Malte Lorenz Brigg, was a formative influence on Sartre. And there is Kafka, in whose major works and parables the absurdity of man's condition has found classical expression. The French existentialists are steeped in Kafka no less than in Dostoevsky. By the same token, it might be objected, Husserl ought to be included, seeing that he influenced both Heidegger and Sartre so profoundly. Husserl himself, however, was decidedly no existentialist, even in the wildest sense of that word, while Rilke and Kafka share some of the most characteristic features of this movement, as does Camus, in whose Myth of Sisyphus, a tragic worldview is redeemed by Nietzsche's Amor Fati. In the end, Rilke, Kafka, and Camus pose a question, seconded by Dostoevsky and by Sartre's plays and fiction. Could it be that at least some part of what the existentialists attempt to do is best done in art and not in philosophy? It sometimes happens, though this is assuredly no rule, that at some given time and place one of the arts, perhaps a single man, towers above the rest and says more adequately what the others say less well. In Italy around the time of 1300, Dante was that man, and 200 years later it was, if not Michelangelo, in any case sculpture and painting. In Dostoevsky's Russia, it was the novel. In Denmark around 1850, it was a new and peculiar kind of prose. We think Kierkegaard and Andersen. In Nietzsche's Germany, there was no poet and no novelist to rival him. It is conceivable that Rilke and Kafka, Sartre and Camus have in their imaginative works reached heights of which the so-called existentialist philosophers, including Sartre, not to speak of Camus' essays, have for all their efforts fallen short. if they have not altogether missed their footing in their bold attempts to scale the peaks and fallen into frequent error and confusion. Whether this is so or not, that is the crucial question which no student of this movement can avoid. So far, no mention has been made of the religious existentialists, except for Kierkegaard, whose influence on Jaspers, Heidegger, and Sartre makes him a key figure of this movement. What of Berdiev, Buber, Bultmann, Tillich, or Marcel? Three things may be said to justify their omission here. First, religion has always been existentialist. It has always been insisted that mere schools of thought and bodies of belief are not enough, that too much of our thinking is remote from that which truly matters, and that we must change our lives. It has always been preoccupied with suffering, death, and dread, with care, guilt, and despair. What is new is that this preoccupation has since Kierkegaard entered philosophy as well as poetry and fiction, severed from its earlier religious context. Secondly, not one of the later religious existentialists has so far left a mark, like Kierkegaard, on literature or on philosophy. Many of them have been deeply influenced by those we have considered here, Bultmann by Heidegger, Marcel by Jaspers, Tillich above all by Schelling. They have availed themselves of a specifically modern language to remind us of what their diverse religions have always said. Third, in an anthology they might, for all that, have been represented. This, however, is not a collection of flowers or a meadow on which we pick a blossom here and there. It is an attempt to tell a story and follow a path. The religious existentialists have not played an important part in our story. It can be told without referring to them. Those, on the other hand, who know the story will be better prepared for the religious existentialists too. Does our story have a moral? After all, the existentialists have no desire simply to divert us. The story is the story of a protest and a challenge. Kierkegaard would have you become a Christian. Nietzsche says, be a man and do not follow me, but yourself. Heidegger tries to arouse us from the oblivion of being, and all of them contrast inauthentic life and authentic life. What is striking to a philosopher is that practically all English-speaking philosophy is included in the condemnation of inauthentic life. It is considered superficial and trivial, nor is this merely a Partesian view. When we have read Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, Rilke, Kafka, Jaspers, Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus, and then look at the prose of English and American philosophers and the problems they discuss, our first impression may well be that they managed the rare feat of being frivolous and dull at once. Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, however, as well as Rilke and Kafka, are dead. And except for Nietzsche, they were not philosophers in any case. And when we compare the writings of our own philosophers with those of Jaspers, Heidegger, and Sartre's philosophic efforts, the picture has changed. It is one of the saddest features of our age that we are faced with an entirely unnecessary dichotomy. On the one hand, there are those whose devotion to intellectual cleanliness and rigor is exemplary, but who refuse to deal with anything but small and often downright trivial questions. In the other camp are men like Toynbee and some of the existentialists who deal with the big and interesting questions, but in such a manner that the positivists point to them as living proofs that any effort of this kind is doomed to failure. Aware of their opponents' errors, both sides go to ever greater extremes. The split widens, and the intelligent layman who is left in the middle will soon lose sight of both. The existentialists have tried to bring philosophy down to earth again, like Socrates, but the existentialist and the analytical philosopher are each only half a Socrates. The existentialist has taken up the passionate concern with questions that arise from life, the moral pathos, and the firm belief that to be serious, a philosophy has to be lived. The analytical philosophers, on the other hand, insist, as Socrates did, too, that no moral pathos, no tradition, and no views, however elevated, justify unanalyzed ideas, murky arguments, or a touch of confusion. In Nietzsche, and more or less in every great philosopher before him, too, philosophy occurred in the tension between these two timeless tendencies, now inclining one way, now the other. Today this dual heritage has been developed in different camps, and between them they have made us aware of the pitfalls of traditional philosophy no less than of each other's faults. That the existentialists and analysts will get together is not likely, but if the feet of future outside the academics. But if the feat of Socrates is really to be repeated and philosophy is to have a future outside the academics, the academies, there will have to be philosophers who think in the tension between analysis and existentialism. Boom.